Welcome to the first pre-summit session for Climate Summit 2020, hosted by Insurance Commissioner Mike Kreidler. Be sure to join us on October 7th for our other dynamic speakers. Now we'll hear from Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz. Dr. Leiserowitz is the director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and will be speaking to us about climate change in the American mind.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you at the Climate Summit. My name is Anthony Leiserowitz. I'm director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. So let me give you a little background about who we are and what we do. So for over a decade, we've been studying how Americans and other societies around the world respond to the issue of climate change. What do people understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change? How do they perceive the risks, the likelihood and severity of sea level rise, or hurricanes, or wildfires, etc.? What kinds of policies do people support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are people engaged in around climate change? Everything from how they use, waste, or conserve energy at home and on the road, their consumer choices, so will they prefer the products and services, like insurance, that will be better for the climate, but also to what extent are they willing to reward or punish companies for their actions on climate change? And I'll just take a moment to say that that's actually a really important lever of social change, and something that a lot of Americans are actually quite willing to do, is to vote with their pocketbook, essentially, not just their votes. Third is social behavior. So that includes communication. Do we talk about this issue? Or more often, why don't we talk about this issue? But also the role of social norms, these unwritten cultural rules that actually guide much of our daily lives and behavior. And then last but not least is political behavior. What leads some people to basically say, I'm not going to stand on the sidelines and watch the world burn. I want to do what I can to get involved, roll up my sleeves, and make a difference within my sphere of influence. That could be among my family, it could be among my friends, it could be in my workplace, it could be in my professional life, right? And for some people, it can even be in the political sphere. So anyway, what leads some people to get really engaged with this issue? Ultimately, though, we are geeky scientists. So our ultimate question is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, and political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue? Others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile. And I'll touch on each of those as we go. Last thing to say is that we've done many dozens of studies here in the United States, increasingly work at the state and local level, and I'll touch on that as well in a moment. But we've also worked a lot internationally, so we've studied this issue in China and India, partnered with the Gallup World Poll for a few years, where we studied this in 130 countries around the world. So really trying to understand how this plays out, both at the local level all the way up to the global scale. So let me just jump in here then and really start with a proposition. And that is that it would be great, it would be wonderful if all Americans could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. A full semester course devoted to here's how the climate system works, here's what the causes are, the consequences, the solutions to climate change. Okay? Preferably taught at Yale, but any university will do. Unfortunately, that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. The great majority of Americans are too busy, they don't have the background, they don't have the interest, they don't have the time to actually take a full semester course on this issue, let alone most important issues. Now, I'm not saying that there are, in fact, millions of Americans who do want those details, and it is incumbent on us in the climate community, and that includes all of us as experts, to go more than halfway to try to meet people where they are, not where you are, where they are, to try to answer those questions and help them engage with this issue as best as we can. But that's not most people. Most people, again, just are never going to have the time or the interest, frankly, to get that involved. So the real question is, given that most people have a very limited amount of shelf space devoted to their brain to this issue, what do they need to know? Okay, and in our work and some of our colleagues around the country, we've identified 5 key ideas that we think, as a baseline, every American should understand. Okay, and moreover, we boiled those 5 ideas down to just 10 words. But a friend of mine in Congress is a haiku master, so she's actually given me an 11-word version, so I'll give you that one. Okay, and here they are. The 5 key ideas are simple. Scientists agree, it's real. It's us, it's bad, but there's hope. Now that seems deceptively simple, okay? In fact, each of those are what I would call meta ideas, okay? They're really big conclusions that you can then back up with lots and lots of evidence, lots of stories, lots and lots of examples, okay? Here's all the ways that we know that climate change is happening, okay? That in fact, the world is warming. Here are the dozens of ways that we know that, yes, of course, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years in Earth history, but this time it's different. This time it's human activities that's driving this massively and rapidly warming planet. Here are the thousands of examples of how climate change is bad right now and is going to get much, much worse in coming decades if we don't change course. And then last and perhaps most importantly, that there's hope, that there are things that we can do as individuals, as communities, as organizations, as states and the nation, and ultimately the world to actually solve this problem. And in fact, those solutions are already there on the shelf just to be deployed. We don't have to invent cold fusion. That would be great if somebody out there can invent cold fusion. We don't need that. We have the capability right now to solve this. So that's it. Those 5 core ideas we think are absolutely critical to communicate. So based on our research with the American public, where are we right now? So here I'm going to show you now the results of over a decade's worth of nationally representative surveys that we've been conducting every spring, every fall, every spring, every fall since 2008. Okay, and let's start with just the big one. Is it real? Okay, and what you see here on the far left is where we were back in the fall of 2008 when 71% of Americans understood that this is in fact real. We saw then a 14 percentage point drop from 2008 bottoming out in 2010. And then slowly it's gone up until just this most recent wave that we did last April, where 73% of Americans, an all-time new high, say that climate change is real. So that's great. Good news that we are now at an all-time record level of Americans who understand that this is happening. But to put that in a little context, if we were talking about Japan, the number would be over 95%. So America still has a way to go before, again, all Americans understand at its fundamentals, this is real. How are we doing then on the causes? Well, here it's not quite so good. When we ask Americans, is it human caused or natural? Only 62%, which is again an all-time high as of last April, understand that climate change is in fact human caused. And that's an important misconception for those of Americans, for instance, the 29% who think it's just natural. Because if it's just natural, then they don't understand why you would do things like, say, put a price on carbon. Maybe climate change is happening, but we'll just adapt to it. We'll just, wait until somehow magically it all works its way out as part of a natural cycle. Not understanding that there are things that we need to do. There are actions we need to take to actually reduce carbon pollution as quickly as possible. So this is an important misunderstanding for many Americans. Further, very few Americans understand that there's overwhelming scientific consensus about these facts, okay? Multiple studies using very different techniques have all converged on basically the same answer, which is that 97% plus of climate scientists are convinced that climate change is happening and human caused. Okay, that's it. Just it's real and it's human caused. Okay, not what is going to happen to the Indian monsoon in the year 2080, about which there's a lot more scientific uncertainty and debate. No, just the fundamentals. Is it real? Is it human caused? There's overwhelming scientific consensus. We are as sure that and confident in the scientific community that climate change is real and human caused as the medical profession is that smoking causes cancer. Okay, but most people don't know that. In our studies, we find that only 21% of Americans understand that that consensus has reached more than 90%. Okay, and that's a consequential misunderstanding because most people are not experts about this issue, or frankly, most issues. We all look to experts to guide us in this incredibly complicated world, insurance being just one giantly complicated issue. We look to experts to help guide us through this increasingly complicated landscape. We can't be experts about everything. So when many Americans have seen, for instance, the media put a climate scientist right next to a climate denier, and to the lay person, they think, oh, well, then it must be 50-50, okay? And so many Americans are taking a wait and see attitude. They're basically saying, hey, scientists, go off in a corner somewhere and haggle it out, figure out, is this real? Is it human caused? And when you do, you'll come tell us, right? Not knowing, of course, that that was done decades ago. One of the other critical things about why this is such a point of confusion is that there's been a massive, well-funded, very sophisticated disinformation campaign run by the fossil fuel industry for decades now, using the exact same strategy as first pioneered by the tobacco industry. You look in the tobacco files, there it is that doubt is our product. They knew they didn't have to convince Americans that smoking was good for you. They just had to convince Americans that the science was still uncertain as to whether smoking was bad or not. And in that case of uncertainty, many Americans would continue to smoke. And they successfully pushed that narrative for several decades and literally raked billions of dollars more money into their pockets, okay? That exact same strategy, including some of the exact same scientists who were saying that smoking isn't bad for human health, have been lifted and planted right into the issue of climate change, where those scientists are saying climate change isn't real, or it's not human caused, or it's not a serious problem. Some even argue that global warming will be good for us, okay? It didn't take a lot of so-called experts to make that claim to confuse many millions of Americans. And unfortunately, we see that many still don't understand that the scientific community has long ago concluded that this is real and it's human caused. So let's move on then to how do we perceive the risk. Now this stands in for a lot of other risk perception type questions about impacts on you and future generations or other Americans, or when will those impacts be felt and so on. We have all of that data available. But here this just ties into one really important variable, and that's worry. And what we found as of our last survey is that only 26% of Americans are very worried about this issue, okay? As in like this is an urgent issue. And that's for a variety of reasons, but one of the most important is one that we identified over a decade ago. And that is that for many Americans, climate change is still seen as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears or developing countries, but not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it's psychologically distant. It just becomes one of a dozen or 100 other issues out there that, yeah, maybe I kind of wish somebody would do something about it, but I don't see why it's important. I don't see why it's urgent. Okay? So for many Americans, they still haven't yet understood climate change is here and now, okay? And that's something that we are all experiencing with this year's extreme weather, right? From the hurricanes that have a record-setting number of hurricanes in the Atlantic this year, to the terrible fires that have been happening out west, to this derecho that swept across the Midwest. I mean, you all know this better than I do because you're on the receiving end of the insurance aspects and dimensions of this issue. So most Americans don't yet understand that critical fact, that this is here and now. Okay. Now, let me also then switch gears here to say that all the stuff I've shown so far is at the national level. And for many years, people would see me give a talk and talk about these national studies, say, hey, this is really helpful, it's very useful, but hey, I'm working in Florida. What can you tell me about Florida? Or I'm working in Wichita, Kansas. What can you tell me about Wichita, Kansas? And unfortunately, my answer was always, well, I can't really, because nobody's ever given me hundreds of millions of dollars to go do surveys in all of those places across the country. So we developed, in response, a statistical model that allows us to take this huge amount of national data that we've collected and do what's called downscaling to basically estimate the level of public engagement and understanding for all 50 states, all 435 congressional districts, the 1,000 largest cities, and all the way down to the county level, so 3,000 plus counties across the country. And I will just say that we also had to, of course, validate that model. Just having a model isn't any good unless you compare it to real world results. We did that as well and found that basically these estimates are accurate to about 98% accuracy. They're so good, in fact, that we're not even sure which is more accurate, our surveys or the model estimates, because most surveys, of course, have a margin of error of plus or minus 3 percentage points. So let me just give you an example of this. This is available on our website called the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. You can Google it and immediately get to a very fun and interactive tool. I'm just going to show you at least a few slides from that tool, but there's plenty more there to explore. So first of all, here's what we would usually look at. Here's the national average. In this particular analysis, 63% of Americans are worried about climate change. So again, useful, but not that useful if you're in a particular state, as most of you are. Here, I'm going to go all the way down to the county level. So you can see that while the national number is 63%, when you look at the county level, you suddenly see that there's great variation across the country. That, in fact, Americans don't have the same viewpoints everywhere. And I'll just pick out my favorite. It's just one of many examples across the country, and that is the state of Texas. Most people have a stereotype of Texas as a deep red, very conservative Republican state, often led by climate-denying governors like Rick Perry, for example. Seems like the last place you could have a constructive conversation about climate change. Turns out that's not true. When you look at Texas, you can see, and by the way, the legend here is that the darker red counties are, the more worried they are, and the darker blue they are, the less worried they are. What you see in Texas is that all those counties right along the Mexican border are more worried about climate change than most of the counties in California. Texas, okay? Why? What's going on there? Well, that aligns with other research that we have found, which is, again, contrary to common wisdom, which is that many people assume that climate change is an issue that only white, well-educated, upper middle income, latte sipping liberals care about. Turns out not to be true. The group in America that cares the most about climate change are Latinos. They're more convinced it's real, that it's human caused, they're more worried about it, they're more willing to get personally involved in advocating for solutions, okay? Most people don't realize that, but that's exactly what's happening in Texas and now, of course, in other critical states like California, Nevada, Colorado, Arizona, and Florida, among others. So anyway, that gives you an example then of how these maps allow you to see things that you just couldn't see before. So, okay, so there's diversity in worry about climate change, but let's take that further. So first of all, the percentage of adults who think that global warming is going to harm plants and animals, okay, back to my point of that is distant. It's not even going to impact humans, right? And overwhelmingly, in every county in America, a majority of Americans say, yeah, climate change, that'll probably hurt other species, okay? But then you ask, well, will it harm people in the United States? And suddenly you say, not so much, okay? Much less so. And then we ask the question, how much will it harm you personally? And now you can see that the map is showing that in almost every county in the country, it's now blue. In other words, less than a majority, in fact, 43% nationally, think that it will affect them personally. Again, reinforcing this sense that climate change is distant, okay? Not something that I'm going to feel. We're going to see how this year plays into this because obviously Americans all across the country are in fact experiencing ever more severe storms, ever more destructive damage being done, wildfires, the derecho, et cetera, heat waves. We didn't even talk about heat waves before. So the impacts are coming home, but people haven't yet heard that, okay? Those need to be interpreted, and that's one of the roles that I think the insurance industry can do uniquely well, is to help communicate to people that these aren't just real and hitting you now, but they're already beginning to affect insurance decisions, okay? They may even be showing up in your insurance bill, for example. Much more could be said about that. Okay, so the last thing I wanna really talk about is the idea that, again, in our, we quickly learned in our work that Americans don't have a single viewpoint about climate change or frankly, any important issue these days. And then too often people divide the country into believers and deniers. That's way too simplistic and frankly is not a useful framework to think about the public either. So over a decade ago, we identified what we call global warming 6 Americas, 6 different audiences that each come at this issue from a different starting point. And again, one of the first rules of effective communication is know your audience. Who are they? What do they know or think they know? What are their underlying values? Who do they trust? Where do they get their information? And so on. And it's only once you understand that you can then begin to engage them on their terms, not yours, on their terms. So here's what we have found as of last November. 31% of Americans are what we call alarmed. They're fully convinced climate change is real, it's human caused, it's a serious and urgent problem. They strongly support policy action, okay? So this is over 70 million Americans. They're already with you. They just need to know what to do. The second group is what we call the concerned, 26%. These are people who think, yeah, it's real, it's human caused, it is a serious problem. But again, they still think of it as distant in time and space. And so as a result, they don't yet see that this is an urgent problem. This is something we have to deal with as soon as possible. Then comes a group we call the cautious at 16%. These are people still on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious or is it kind of overblown? They're paying attention, but are really just still kind of confused. Then comes a group we call the disengaged, a small but important group who basically say, you know, I think I once heard the term global warming, but I don't know anything about it. I don't know what the causes are. I don't know what the consequences are. I certainly don't know what the solutions are. So it's just basic information. It's awareness that they really need. Then comes a group we call the doubtful. These are people, 10%, who say, yeah, you know, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's natural. Nothing we had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. I don't think about it all that much, and I don't really see it as much of a risk. And then last but not least, at 10% is a group we call the dismissive. These are people who are strongly convinced it's not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem, and most of whom, they literally tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and many other such narratives. Now, importantly, they're 10%. They're only 10%, but they're a really loud 10%. They're really vocal 10%. They're a 10% that's more than represented in the halls of Congress and in the current White House, okay? And they have tended to dominate the public square, okay? And you all know what I'm talking about. You can go to USA Today and look at a great article, a very well-written article about, you know, recent findings of climate change science, for example. Good article, but then you read the comments, okay? And those comments can be, half or more of them can be from people from this dismissive point of view. And so it's easy to come away as a reader, as a journalist, as a policymaker with the false impression that it's half or more of the country. It's not, okay? It's only 10%, okay? And in fact, the 10% of that 10%, the ones that are actually active on Twitter and Facebook, and I know I'm breaking ground here for you, but Twitter does not equal the public. That is not reality. It is a very small number of people who are active on Twitter. The number of people who are active from the dismissive standpoint on Twitter are tiny numbers. They're loud, but they are very active. And I'm not kidding when I'm saying that for the rest of us, we have tended to let the last hair on the tail of the dog wag the entire dog. Because the fact is that 90% plus of the country is willing to have a constructive conversation about climate change. We get too fixated on that tiny 10% that is really loud, okay? While ignoring the other 90%, and that's a huge mistake. All right, just to help you understand that there's very different conversations happening in this country all at the same time, we actually have asked Americans, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what question would you ask? So the doubtful and the dismissive on the right-hand side of your screen, their main question is, how do you know that global warming is happening or human caused? And on a deeper level, their real question is, why should I trust you, okay? The middle groups are saying, okay, maybe it is happening in human cause, but so what? Why should I care? What does this got to do with me or anything I actually care about, okay? Whereas the alarmed and the concerned, their main question is, okay, I got it. It's happening, it's human cause, but what do we do? What can I do? What can we do collectively as communities, as cities, as states, as the nation, as the world? How do we actually solve this problem, okay? So again, 3 totally different conversations all happening concurrently. Last thing I want to just quickly talk about though is that these are changing, okay? The proportion of these different groups has been changing over time. Here you're looking at the 5 years from 2014 through 2019. And what you see is that back in 2014, 11% of the country was alarmed and 12% of the country was dismissive. So basically they were equal, 1 to 1. Fast forward to the end of 2019 and you see that the alarmed has grown by 21 percentage points to now is 31% of the country, while the dismissive have actually declined a bit to just 10%. So whereas they were 1 to 1 back in 2014, at the end of 2019, there were 3 alarmed for every 1 dismissive. That's a real reflection of a shift, a major shift that's been going on in this country within the political, social, and cultural climate of climate change, okay? Shaping and creating a much more open space for talking about this issue and beginning to take action on this issue. So the nice thing is that we are now talking about this issue from the vantage point of 2020 as opposed to 2014, when it was harder to talk about the issue. Today, that's just not the case. Okay? So just to end with a few quick recommendations. Number one, break the spiral of silence. You need to talk about it. If we don't talk about the issue, then most people think, well, then how important can it be? Because we're talking about the things that everybody says are important. So you gotta talk about it. Secondly, know your audience. Tailor your communications, and that really means listen to your audience. Okay, the natural inclination is people wanna go, oh, I need to communicate about an issue. Let me tell you everything I know about it. No, the first thing you need to do is to listen to your audience to figure out where they are, where they're coming from, what are the questions in their minds. Also importantly, what are the experiences that you can elicit out of them to bring to this. My guess is that you could talk to people all across each one of your states and say, how have you been seeing the weather changing? Have you been harmed at all by recent fires or smoke or floods or storms and so on? And listen to them, let them engage based on their own personal experience before you begin to say, well, you know what, all of those are getting worse and we know why. And here's some of the work that we've been doing to try to help people solve this problem, okay? That's a totally different way of structuring the conversation, but in the end, much more likely to be effective. Third, know that there are these 6 different audiences and they're each coming at this issue from a different perspective, but don't overemphasize the voices of the dismissive. They're only 10%, they're just loud. Fourth, and there's no formulas here, but this is a really helpful guideline that has come out of the work, especially of my dear colleague Ed Maybach down at George Mason University, and that is use simple, clear messages. Repeat it often, 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 probably at least 7 times, because that's about the time they're finally hearing you for the first time, by a variety of trusted messengers, including you. Okay? And then last, just to recapitulate, scientists agree. It's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. Thank you very much for your attention.